way that she described, of actually beginning to speak as though we're talking to ourselves rather than we're talking to a much, much wider group of people. The title of today's discussion was The Elephant in the Room, the elephant in the election, thus that being climate change. And clearly that has been the case. As the debate and the discussions around the election take place, very little is about the issue of climate change, very little is about what can be done to tackle the climate change. There have been a few moments of hope, but those have been generated by the movement. Thousands taken to the streets in March around the Time to Act demonstration, raising up the significance, the importance of climate change, and previously in September at the People's Climate March. In terms of our own politicians, it hasn't squeezed its way into that debate. One of the things that the politicians do, or at least I believe that they do, is they justify often their unwillingness to engage in this issue by somehow putting the responsibility back onto ordinary people. And they sort of, there's kind of like a narrative goes, we would talk about this issue if ordinary people cared about this issue, but they don't. They just care about jobs or austerity or something like this. By the way, which are things that people do care about and you should care about, because they're pretty damn important in people's everyday lives. But they kind of somehow claim that they can't engage in this issue in any kind of direct or very high profile way, because the vast majority of people aren't interested in it. And that isn't true. It isn't true both in terms of the opinion polls. So every single opinion poll that comes out shows that people do regard climate change as a very significant issue. Usually they're around 67-70% of people say that they think it's an important issue and that there should be action taken on it. I mean, I like to think, if there was any other issue that was scoring so highly in the opinion polls over and over again, if it was the question of immigration, for example, 67% of people saying that they thought immigration was an important issue, or something like that. There was no way the politicians would stay quiet on this issue. They would use those statistics to try and justify their own arguments and their own policy and their own position on this issue. But when it comes to climate change, Suzanne, they stay very quiet and they tend to argue that it's ordinary people that haven't got any interest in it. Anecdotally, I'm getting some feedback, Pete, that's why.
Hold it up to your mouth.
All right. Anecdotally, if you do what the woman, I don't know your name, sorry, said earlier on, and Andrea said, if you engage in conversations with people about climate change, you will usually find that people are worried about the issue of climate change. They will say things like, yes, I'm worried about it, I'm a bit confused, sometimes about the degree to which it's being caused by human activity, but usually people are willing to listen to this. What people are uncertain about most strongly is there anything that could be done about it? And if there is something that can be done about it, can it be done as quickly as the climate activists and the environmentalists seem to suggest? So I want to just talk a little bit about climate jobs and where that kind of initiative, what that kind of initiative came from. And it came very much from the kind of things that I've just been talking about finding ourselves as climate activists within the climate movement, as trade unionists within the climate movement and within the trade union movement, finding a situation where, and I'm taking the story back a good few years, where it appeared that a lot of people accepted what was a mistaken assertion. They seemed to accept that if you were going to be part of the movement that was interested in people's workers' rights, in their trade union rights, in their ability to be able to live decent lives with decent jobs, then somehow that would be mutually exclusive to being somebody who cares about the environment, somebody who wants to see a massive reduction in emissions and a massive reduction in emissions in a very rapid period of time. So a bunch of us back in probably about 2007, 2008 got together because we didn't accept that these were mutually exclusive arguments, and we didn't accept either that within the trade union movement it was only full of people who cared about jobs regardless of what the consequences of creating those jobs were, and we didn't also believe that within the environmental movement it was full of people who didn't care about workers' rights, about social justice and all of those kind of issues. Clearly neither movement was that the kind of image that we got. and at the same time there didn't seem to be any kind of arguments that bridged the divide that appeared to demonstrate that they were not mutually exclusive and that we can actually care about social justice, we can care about workers' rights, and we can tackle emissions as well at the same time. So the idea of...
Over to this side.
Okay.
Keep it away from the amp.
Okay, so the idea of climate jobs, emerged out of that kind of debate and that kind of discussion. I'm actually incredibly proud of the work that we've done in climate jobs. It was a little little understood concept a few years ago. I tend to think now it's something that has a much wider purchase amongst much wider numbers of people, both within the movement and I feel increasingly outside of the existing movement amongst ordinary people who are beginning to be open to and willing to engage with some of the issues that they realise are vital for them and certainly vital, or as they see it, vital for their children. So I'm incredibly proud of the work that we've done. I think we've made some strides. That's not to suggest at all that there aren't big strides still to be made, but it has begun to be a bit more of a common sense that actually in tackling climate change and in tackling it quickly, we can dramatically reduce emissions and at the same time create jobs, and we can create decent jobs that allow people to be able to contribute towards living in a positive and constructive kind of society at the same time. I want to just try and finish up on a couple of things. I want to finish up on trying to talk a little bit about what those kind of climate jobs are. Because big business is part of the problem, and because very early on in the climate movement there was a kind of argument that sometimes one support, which was, that somehow, business is going to be able to shift itself over to a different way, a different energy source, and operate in a different way. One of the things that we all argued for within the Climate Jobs publication, which now has the support of 9 unions, which means that we're being listened to within 9 national unions. One of the things that we argued for is that you can't leave it to the market. The market has proved completely ineffective in every way, shape or form, not least of which because it is at the root of the problem. So we argued in terms of a national climate service as something that at least echoes the kind of beliefs behind the NHS when it was first established, that if there is need, you meet that need. You don't organise things in order to maximise the profits of a small elite. So in that sense, the National Climate Service is sort of with a vision that if we are to create the kind of climate jobs that we need, then that will have to be done with an eye to need. In other words, what does the climate need in order to survive? How quickly does the climate need to be decarbonised? That the jobs have to be created in that way rather than in order to try and ensure that some businesses make some money out of the efforts in creating climate jobs. So we argued strongly for a climate service, and we argued that there are some key areas in which climate jobs need to be created. The obvious one is in the energy system, so the coal does need to stay in the ground, and there are plenty of sources of renewable energy which could meet our energy needs. We also have argued in terms of a different kind of transport system, and one that can meet people's everyday needs without forcing people into their cars, because that's often through the process of deregulation what has happened to our transport system, as the emphasis has gone on the needs of big business to make profit out of transport. Less and less people have found themselves, or certainly the poorest people in society have found themselves in a situation where they can't actually access decent public transport, and at best they end up in cars of some nature, whether that be their own cars or whether that be taxi services, which is essentially what's happening in rural areas. There isn't a transport system. And of course, in terms of everyday opportunities, that limits people's opportunities as well. So we've argued in terms of a transport system, which is a public transport system, an integrated transport system, and one which therefore has an eye to massively reducing the kinds of emissions that are involved with moving people around, but it also has an eye to ensuring that people can actually meet their everyday needs as well. In addition to that, people will have heard it before, it's about energy use, and it is about opportunities to reduce energy use. We live in a country which has massively leaky housing stock. There's no effort put into reducing, or there was a limited effort put into reducing energy within that kind of housing stock that we have. These are things that could be tackled through kind of an insulation program by helping people to work in communities to insulate homes and help to reduce energy use. And there's a final, and there's other jobs as well. The recent edition talks about waste. Really interesting program on the TV at the moment. I don't know if you're watching it. The Wasteman, you seen it? It's on tonight. Sorry to digress. It's just a really, really good program. It's about being men and women, but they tend to be men, and it's about the kind of job that they do, and it's a really interesting program because you've got these ordinary working class, mostly guys, talking about what they do and how important it is that we do recycle waste and that we don't chuck away the piles and piles and piles of stuff that we do, how that's contributing to an environmental crisis. And it's just a really refreshing thing to get a picture of ordinary people engaging in their everyday lives in the kind of work that really does make a difference, and understanding that this is not just about them taking home a pay packet at the end of the day, at the end of the week. This is also about their contribution to living in a society which is environmentally safe, which isn't jeopardizing massive climate change. The first episode was really good. I don't know what the second episode is going to be like, but anyway, there's my recommendation for you tonight's viewing. BBC One, I think it is, or something like that. So we talk about waste in our final edition, the kind of jobs that could be created there, and also, again, these are opportunities to massively reduce emissions. And we also talk about food, and I know food is a huge issue, and we've begun to sort of take up some of those issues in the final pamphlet. Okay, all right, I want to finish on this. Every now and then when I read stuff, I want to finish on something that I can't see, so give me 1 second. Yeah, every now and then when I read stuff, bits and bobs of blogs, or maybe some email communication or something like that, and something may have been mentioned in terms of climate jobs, it's usually a positive thing. But one of the things I've noticed occasionally is that some people, and I'm now talking largely within the movement because it's a kind of debate within the movement, sometimes I see people say, all right, I like the idea of climate jobs, but I'm not comfortable with the idea of green growth, and I think that's quite right. I'm not comfortable with the idea of green growth either, but I think it's a slightly, or at least put it this way around, from my perspective, I think that's a slightly misleading way of reading climate jobs and the publication, or certainly the kind of initiatives that we've taken around climate jobs. I've got one in my bag. I'll hold it up later if you haven't seen it. I wouldn't put it like that. I don't think that climate jobs is an argument in favour of green growth. What I think climate jobs is an argument in favour, it's not an argument, in favour of expanding the economy in order to create jobs. That's not what climate jobs are about. It is an argument about reducing emissions. So fundamentally, the idea of climate jobs is how can we very quickly reduce emissions. It is also, though, an argument, I would say, that does recognise that inequality is built into the system, and the kind of discourse, the narrative within climate jobs is that in recognising that inequality and in hoping to see the implementation of 1 million climate jobs, it's one that hopes to be able to begin to redress through something like climate jobs that inequality. It's one that recognises the inequality of unemployment, the injustice of unemployment, of having young people and older people sat around doing nothing at a time, when they can be and should be contributing to society. It's one that recognises the inequality of big business making all the decisions. That at the moment we live in a situation, usually regardless of what government we have in power, I don't need to lecture you on this, in which it's big business that that seems to determine the real outcome of the decision. So it's also one that recognises that. It's one that recognises the inequality of a situation where it is a small elite who concentrate resources in their hands, whether those be the resources of wealth, whether it be the resources of power, or whether that be the resources of our natural environment. It's a small elite that concentrate those resources in their hands. It's an argument, although it's an argument focused on the UK, it is one that has an eye to the world that we live in, and therefore recognise that 1 billion people globally still live without electricity. And in the UK, there is huge fuel poverty for large numbers of people. So it is fundamentally not an argument for growth, not at all. It's an argument for dramatically reducing emissions, but it's an argument which frames itself within a wider understanding of the inequality at the heart of our society and of the desire to challenge that inequality and to end that inequality. So it is fundamentally an argument not in favour of growth, but in favour of redistribution of resources, redistribution of wealth, redistribution of power, and redistribution of natural resources out of the hands of a tiny elite and into the hands of the majority of people who hopefully could begin some kind of democratic control and decision making based on the needs of ordinary people, but also fundamentally based on the needs of the planet that we live on.